would tell me I couldn't not live in sin, but they expected me to look like I could. You know what I'm saying? And so I just got really, really good at faking things. Our church was super judgy. There was no culture of like common confession or accountability. It was very much like, if you're struggling alone. So sorry for you. So at home and at church, I was the perfect Christian kid, so to speak. At school, I didn't have any convictions because I just wanted to blend in with whatever group I was with. And then in the privacy of my room, I had a little like plaque above my desk with a quote from Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. I don't know if you guys are familiar. It's a classic. It's great. Yes. Yeah, it's so good. But it was a plaque that said, in my own little corner, in my own little chair, I can be whoever I want to be. And that's where my computer was. And that's how I felt, like in this corner where I can be on the internet and nobody knows my real name, nobody sees my face, I can be whatever I want to be. And that was where I like really explored and felt like my truest self. The problem was I was super young and I was exposed to a lot of really damaging things online at a really young age. So I developed a super foul language. I developed a pornography addiction before I even really understood what pornography was. It was just a really lonely, devastating thing, and I wasn't even old enough to really comprehend and had no concept for discipleship or someone to confide in. And then when I was 14, I went on my first mission trip to Romania and I got saved. I saw the believers there living in constant community. They were at the church every day. They served one another, and they just had this constant mindset of worship that I had not ever seen in my church. And I felt like this is the true God, like the God that loves the nations, where these people that don't even speak my language, they get something I don't get, and I want to have what they have. So I gave my life to Jesus. I got back to the States, and I couldn't wait to tell everybody about it. So I started inviting my unbelieving friends to church and found very quickly that they did not feel welcome there, and that God's laws were a barrier, a roadblock for them to walking with Jesus. And so that was really devastating. And then I shared my testimony with my youth group, and they invited my parents to come hear me speak. And I told them all about this life I'd been living online. I don't know why. I thought, like, this will go over fine because now I love Jesus and they're going to be excited for me. And afterwards, my mom came and she hugged me and said, oh, how proud she was that I shared my testimony. And then she said, but we're going to have to take that plaque off your wall and take the computer out of your room because I can't trust you anymore. Like, I can't trust you in your own space. And I remember thinking, like, so is my life any different now that I have Jesus? It just seems like I'm still gonna always do the wrong thing. I can't be trusted to ever do the right thing. I'm not empowered to do the right thing. There was no talk of forgiveness, no talk of freedom. And so that was my background in church, was wrestling with the character of the Jesus I had met in Romania. Hi, welcome. And the character of the God I seemed to find in his laws, in his word, and feeling like they were not the same thing. So I don't know if that's any of your experience, but that's what I'm speaking out of today and why we thought it would be so cool to share this biblical truth with you. So that being said, Richard's going to dive into the Bible. Most of us, when we think about God's laws, we think of what? You can just shout it out.
Levitical law.
Yeah, Levitical law, specifically
Leviticus.
The Ten Commandments, exactly, which we find in Exodus, but yeah, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, all the boring books, right? And we get there and we're like, all right, what am I supposed to do with this laundry list of law? And we forget that there's a whole book before that gives us context for them, and that the Bible's not a manual for behavior modification, it's a story, it's a narrative. And so these laws are given at a certain point in the narrative, and they have a role. And so Richard's going to give us the backdrop in Genesis for that.
Cool. Before I get into it, I won't be offended if you just do like a thumbs up in the back or something if I need to talk louder. Sometimes the longer I talk, the quieter I get, so just give me some signal, I'll talk louder. So first we're going to hit Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28. It says, Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves along the ground." So from these 3 verses, we see 3 things. The first is that man is created in God's image and has an ongoing, intimate fellowship with God. The second thing is that man is also chosen to be God's representative on earth and ultimately partners in his work. And the third thing is that they're given authority to rule over the nature and the beasts of the field. Next, we'll go into Genesis 3, verses 1 through 7. Also, if I need to slow down at all, let me know. I'll give you a break. But Genesis 3 says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman then said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die.' 'You will certainly not die,' the serpent said to the woman, 'for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.' When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." So far, we see that there's only one command given from God at this point, and it's to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? So the first thing that we see is, when we refer to this specific passage as the fall, is that Eve is handing over her God-given authority to this serpent, right? So just before in Genesis 1, we talked about how she had authority, that Adam and Eve had authority over nature. And here she hands it over and lets the beast tell her what to do, right? And there's some irony with this as well. The serpent tells the humans that they shall be like God, but we know that they already were, because they were created in his likeness. A lot of people say they were created in God's image, and some translations do say in his likeness. And you can't be any more like God than created like God, right? The second thing that's ironic is that he promises that they'll know good and evil, but they already knew that, right? Because God had told them what was good and what was right and what was wrong. All they had to do is trust and believe in God. So the eating of the fruit doesn't just represent one single act of disobedience against some arbitrary rule, right? But the knowledge, right? The knowledge of good and evil is more accurately translated as having the authority to decide for yourself what's good and what's evil, what's right and what's wrong. So the eating of the fruit actually represents man's ongoing decision to choose for himself what is good and bad, rather than trust God what is best for him. In other words, the fall of man is about the rejection of the lordship of God. The problem with this is that when we think about it, we don't have the infinite perspective to be able to decide these things for ourselves, because we don't know what's best in every circumstance, because we're not good and we're not smart. We heard a little bit of that from Destiny this morning.
She set us up so well.
She
We planned that.
The last interesting thing to note in this passage is about the verse with the fig leaves. If you've read any of the New Testament, basically, you've probably come across some passage about a fig tree. The one we're going to hone in on today is the passage about Jesus cursing the fig tree. And it's funny because he curses it because it has leaves but doesn't have any fruit on it, right? And so it's strange because the Bible also specifies that it wasn't the season for figs. So Jesus just says, it's not the season for figs, but I'm still upset, so curse you. You know, it's so strange. But the unique things about fig trees is that they can produce leaves without producing fruit, right? And then vice versa. So most trees, they typically produce leaves to show you that the fruit's coming, that you can come up and approach it and take from it and have sustenance. But these fig trees, like we just mentioned, can falsely advertise that they're being productive when they're actually have no substance. So this is pretty much the perfect picture of how man is trying to solve our own problems. I'll talk about my story a little bit. If you were to look at my life kind of like, what's that Christmas movie?
It's a Wonderful Life?
It's a Wonderful Life. When he walks through his whole life, he's like, look at all these things. If you were to do something like that, look at my upbringing all the way up to college, you'd see that I had a maximum of 2 friends at all times. I didn't know how to make a friend. I was I don't know, I just wasn't a cool person to be around, I guess. I don't know. And so there was a struggle that I had, and those 2 friends that I had, I would say, like, I would describe them just as people that would spend time with me outside of the regular context that I saw. Right? So if we were friends in school, we would spend time sometimes outside of school, just hanging out. But there was nothing like regular. We wouldn't just hop on and do something together. I was always like the obligatory friend that was like, oh shoot, Fred couldn't make it today. I guess call Richard. Why not? So it never feels good to be plan B, right? To be the backup guy. But on top of that, I also had like an inferiority complex within my family. I did baseball for like 9 years, but as the years progressed, I was not getting as skilled as the other people around me were, so I was getting worse and worse and worse. And eventually I stopped playing, but my parents never invested in me. They were never like, here, take these lessons, do this, do that, take these classes or whatever. But my younger sister, whenever she was doing dance and stuff, they immediately invested. They were like, okay, let's get her some dance lessons, let's do this, let's do that. And spent a lot of financial support and a lot of emotional support with her as well. And I didn't receive any. So I felt pretty left out and pretty alone and kind of like not proud of my life at all. And so I knew that something had to change. You can't just live life depressed all day. I was like, I gotta fix something. So I decided to try to devote as much time as I could in the church. So I went to the local church, and this was about high school time for me. And I was just doing as much as I could to hopefully do all the right things, right? So that maybe people would be proud of me for once and then give me some sense of belonging, because I felt like I was totally shut out. But the truth is with that, like anytime anyone got semi-close to me, right? Anytime we'd have one conversation and they'd actually ask about my life, I'd be like, I don't know, I just kind of do this all day. Like there was no deeper meaning, there's no deeper thought, because my means had become my end, right? The whole goal of what I was trying to do didn't get anywhere because all I was doing was what I was doing. And so all the hard work that I had done, it was similar to producing leaves like the fig tree, because I would do all that stuff and then it'd be a waste because there's no fruit in my life that I would be able to share with others at that point.
Yeah, so we've given you a little backdrop in Genesis, right? We know what we had in the garden with God. We had ongoing fellowship with Him. We had authority. We had work to do, a partnership. We know how we lost it. Something interesting is we were on the way here, we were listening to a Bible Project podcast, which I would highly recommend, by the way, as a resource if you've never checked it out. They are super, super helpful. We were listening to it, and Tim Mackey was sharing about how we typically think of the Garden of Eden as like having to earn our right to eat from the tree of life. So like I've got to pass the test of the tree of knowledge of good and evil to get to that tree of life. But the reality was that Adam and Eve had constant access to the tree of life. They were created with access to it, right? And it was a free gift. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was just this constant choice that was available to them to walk down a road where that would no longer be available. And so that's where we're at this point in the narrative of Scripture, right? Is we've walked down a road where that's no longer available to us. God's not going to let us eat from the tree of life and have eternal life and just have an eternity to get worse and worse and worse and worse, right? Like if you have a really bad roommate, Scroggins always says, our campus pastor says it this way, if you have a roommate that's really bad at doing the dishes and then you give them an eternity to continue to be bad at doing the dishes, it's just going to get worse and worse. So God cuts off their access to that. And now, at this point in Scripture, we're wondering, okay, how are we going to get that back? God has promised that there's going to be some snake crusher, some human that comes along and is his perfect partner again, and is his perfect image again. And so, as we're reading the Bible, we're looking for, is this the person? Is this the person? So we get to the story of Noah. Is he the one? He's blameless in God's sight, and then, oh no, he gets drunk and makes some stupid decisions. It's not him. Is it Abraham? Oh no, it's not him either. Is it Moses, right? So by the time we get to the law, we're looking for that person that is going to restore us back to the garden. Okay, does that make sense? Cool. Now, the law, the fun part. So the law in Hebrew is referred to as the Torah. You might have heard that word before. And the Torah is made up of 613 laws. This includes the Ten Commandments. And they can be broken up or divided into 3 categories, okay? So when we think of law code in our cultural context, we think of like the letter of the law. So what this says is what I have to do exactly, and that's what's legal for me, okay? But in ancient law, they didn't look at the law that way. So that's why there's so many of them, and they're all really specific. So if I'm reading the Torah, and I get to a verse that says, when you're attacking, when you're waging war against a nation, and you've been there a while, and you decide, you're hungry or whatever, don't cut down the fruit trees. Just take some fruit off of them and eat it, but don't cut them down. What have the trees ever done to you? There's a literal verse that says that. And if you're reading that and you've never waged war against a nation, you're like, I guess this law doesn't apply to me, so scrap it, right? But what the Israelites understood in their ancient context was that these laws were examples of an ideal applied to a specific situation. Does that make sense? So even the 10 Commandments would sound pretty general. Do not murder. Jesus taught actually meant that was the application of an ideal. So the ideal is don't have contempt for other human beings, don't view them as less than, so much so that it gets to the point that you murder them. That would be very bad. But the concept is just don't feel that way about people at all. Jesus says treat people with kindness, respect, love, right? So the ideal behind the law, the wisdom behind the law is what we're looking for. But I'm going to go ahead and break these into some categories for us. So the first category of biblical law is civil law. Okay, these are the cultural responsibilities of the nation of Israel. Things that were supposed to set them apart from other nations and preserve them as a people group. Okay. This also encompasses the establishment of a judicial system. So this was how they would handle civil disputes within their family. If there was a disagreement, refer to the civil law. Okay. Or if there wasn't something in the civil law that covered that yet, you would add it as an example of an ideal being applied, right? The next one is ceremonial law. Am I going to go too fast if I switch? Okay. Ceremonial law. This is a visual primer that artistically shows something that is spiritually true. Okay? Typically meant for the priest to follow. There were ways for the Israelites as a whole to participate in the ceremonial law, but these included things like your sacrifices, your feasts and festivals, things the priests were supposed to wear. All of that is ceremonial law. So it's something tangible to engage in that makes you realize the spiritual truth that it's representing. And then the last one is moral law. This is what we're always picking out and saying, okay, I guess this is what applies to me. These are the transcultural, universal, applicable in principle to any person laws. Okay? They dictate how we individually and internally conduct ourselves. So the 10 Commandments would be moral law. And so as you're reading through the Torah, you might be able to categorize. Some of them are a little harder than others to categorize into these groups. And they all have different functions, but there is a common thread running through them. And that is that they are all rooted in reality. God doesn't ever give a law that's random or arbitrary or a test or anything like that. They're rooted in reality. So they are not the origin of truth. It's not like before that law existed, murdering was okay. Murdering was never okay. The law is just a revelation, illustration, or clarification of what is already true and in place in our world. Sounds confusing, and it's a lot to write, so I'll give you a second. But one way to think about this that might be helpful is thinking about the laws of physics. I'm not going to get crazy on you. Richard's the physics major, I was a music major, so we're not going too far down that road. But when you think about the laws of physics, Isaac Newton, right, before the apple fell on his head, it's not like gravity wasn't a thing. Gravity still was a thing. No one had put an equation to it yet, but it was still how our world worked and operated. And Newton just figured out a way to explain it. So you can be ignorant of the laws of physics. Maybe you just don't know they exist at all, or you don't understand them, or you can purposefully rebel against them and say, no, that's stupid. Man was meant to fly. Gravity shouldn't be a thing. But they will still have their natural consequences no matter what. If you jump off a building, there's only one way you're going to fall, and that's down. Okay? God's laws function the same way. You can be ignorant of them, or you can disagree with them, but all they're doing is describing how we were created to live in this world that was created for us. Another way of thinking about it, we are punished by our sin more than we are punished for it. We are punished by our sin more than we are punished for it. You won't always see examples in the Bible of someone breaking the law and then God smiting them with a lightning bolt. Typically, he just hands them over to the natural consequences of their choice. It's kind of like what Destiny was saying this morning. Every call answered will have a cost. Romans 1:28 talks about this specifically. It says, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. He just gives them over to the natural consequences of the choices they made. And we can see that in the civil, ceremonial, and moral law in all three. So a lot of the civil laws will have to do with like, hey, don't eat this meat, or don't eat it that way. Or, hey, wash your hands, or if you're menstruating, go outside the camp and do it there. And it seems arbitrary and weird, but these were just the Lord's way of explaining, hey, we just came out of COVID, we understand this. If you don't wash your hands, you will get sick. If you eat meat that's not prepared properly, you will get sick. So if they didn't obey, it's not like God, smited them. They would get sick and die. He was explaining the best way for them to live. And that's why Destiny said this morning, God's laws, when you obey them, come with blessings, because it's the best way for you to live. Winky Pratton says, when you break God's law, it breaks you. All right, how are we doing so far, everybody? We tracking? Awesome. All right, we're almost halfway through. I'm gonna let Richard take it away again.
Cool. I mentioned to you earlier about my life and how I started spending a lot of time in the church. Most of it was devoted to the youth group. I would spend somewhere, sounds crazy, but somewhere upwards of 15 hours a week as a high schooler, just in the church, just doing whatever anyone asked. I would do whatever I would help with. Sound and lights, I would help with worship a bit. I would do a small group. I would do, on top of that, any conferences or any extra thing that we had going on weekends or whatnot. And so, I had been with the youth group for 6 years, and I had served them a lot for 4. Right, and so being with them that long, we started doing this thing where for anyone that served at the youth group for a certain amount of time, they would get a special week devoted to them almost, and it would typically be a surprise. But after a while, people started catching on. But it would be we'd have some award that we made up, and then gave to them and give them a good word, try to talk them up, honor them in that sense, and then have a little party and just have people mingle and just appreciate the person and their service and their work. And so I remember telling the pastor weeks in advance of when my last week was, and trying to make sure he knew, so I would get that thing. Because as you know, I was looking for something to be proud of. I was hunting for this thing, for some sense of belonging. And so I was really anticipating this time of like, oh man, it's my last week. Okay, I'm gonna be able to get to the stage and just talk a little bit about how like, I care about these people. And then moment after moment that night, nothing happened. And I was like, what the heck, bro? It's like I'm about to dip out, and I did a lot for you guys. You're not gonna love me, but and then that night, like I walked out, and no one batted an eye. No one like said bye to me. No one said anything. So I remember feeling really like broken and just stupid and like, who am I? Like, why did I do all this work and then nothing pay off?
6 years down the road.
Seriously, yeah, 6 years. And I realized that like in me searching for my honor and my glory through this, I had broken God's law of idolatry. I was looking more towards the gods of success and approval than I was the God himself.